Now to the global pandemic and the growing evidence that it may have originated through the Wuhan Institute of Virology through an accidental leak. No one is suggesting this was an act of biological warfare. No one is saying the lab leak was deliberate. But places like the Wuhan Institute of Virology have very sophisticated and stringent virus containment practices and processes, and they have them for a reason, because leaks and accidents can occur. So, as usual, when there's a chance that human blunders can play a role, it's never a wild bet to back the stuff up. But at the ABC, as we've shown you previously, their Media Watch program has attacked journalists raising the lab leak theory. Paul Barry seemed to think he knew that this was not the source of the leak.
So, given all those expert doubts, was this sensational treatment really justified?
Batman! Exclusive!
We think not. We also think Markson should have told readers that almost every virus expert had dismissed the lab escape theory. And we believe this get out in the middle of the story, that the telly's not suggesting the two scientists were responsible for the outbreak, is insufficient.
Insufficient curiosity from the ABC, I reckon. It's the antithesis of journalism. Paul Barry and the ABC attacked Sharri Markson of this channel and the Australian newspaper for exclusives like this interview, where she had a US expert explain new intelligence about Wuhan Institute of Virology staff being hospitalised with illness in November 2019, right at the time the pandemic began.
There's information that they fell sick, and at least one of them was hospitalized that I'm aware of. There were multiple staff members that did have to go to hospital and appear to have had conditions of COVID-19. You don't normally go to the hospital with influenza.
This story has now turned up in the esteemed Wall Street Journal. The article begins, 3 researchers from China's Wuhan Institute of Virology became sick enough in November 2019 that they sought hospital care, according to previously undisclosed intelligence that could add weight to growing calls for a fuller probe of whether the COVID-19 virus may have escaped from the lab. Well, you heard all this first here on Sky News in March, thanks to Sharri Markson. The lab leak theory is now getting far more attention worldwide. The Wall Street Journal went on to say the Wuhan Institute has refused to share raw data, safety logs and records on its coronavirus work with bats, which many consider the most likely source of this virus and the pandemic. It's fascinating stuff. Remember, Sharri Markson and reporting on this station and in the Australian and in the Daily Telegraph have not said the virus did come from the lab. They said it was a scenario that makes sense according to the evidence and must be fully investigated. Others, like Paul Barry and Media Watch at the ABC, prefer to accept on blind faith the denials from Beijing. Now, the Fairfax or 9 Media newspapers have tended to go along with this China and ABC line as well until the weekend, when they ran this article. Suddenly, they say the lab leak story is worth a second look too, according to their North American correspondent Matthew Knott. The lab leak theory, regarded as fringe just a few months ago, has rapidly become mainstream in the US, says Knott. Both sides agree more evidence would be useful, and the Wuhan Institute's logs and samples should be opened to outside scrutiny. Alleluia! Isn't this exactly the direction that Sharri Markson's reporting has directed us for almost a year? A period in which the Sydney Morning Herald and the ABC, instead of following up on her reports, have chosen to attack and dismiss them. Oh, and who retweeted that Sydney Morning Herald article? None other than Paul Barry, the Media Watch host. Suddenly he's interested in reality. I wonder if he'll attack the Herald now or the Wall Street Journal. I think not. I wonder if he'll apologise to Markson and admit she was right. I wonder if the ABC will actually get some journalists to investigate this biggest story of the decade. I doubt it, though. They're too busy with climate change alarmism and conservative witch hunts. Let's go to Dr. John Lee from the United States Studies Centre. John, thanks for joining us on this. The evidence has been compelling that this warrants further investigation all along, but it's really starting to mount, isn't it?
Well, I really need to correct something that Paul Barry said in the clip that you just showed. Most scientists do not think that it comes from a bat. It's evenly divided. And in fact, not so long ago, a group of 18 scientists published an open letter in the journal Science, essentially saying that the Wuhan lab theory in many respects seems more credible than a bat theory. But look, in any event, I think the problem is that people have become too political about this. If you like Donald Trump, you support the Wuhan lab theory. If you don't like Donald Trump, you support the bat theory. That's got nothing to do with science. And if you look at the evidence and if you look at the behaviour of the Chinese Communist Party, you've got to say the evidence, or at least circumstantial evidence, is starting to lean towards some kind of, it's the lab theory is starting to look a lot more credible than it did, or than most people assumed that it was a few months ago.
Yeah, I think you're right to a degree, although I think anyone who looks at the evidence can tell you the lab leak theory needs investigation. We know the closest related virus came 5,000 kilometres for research into that lab. We know that there was a shutdown around October, November. We now know about these illnesses. It's the anti-Trump forces last year, because Trump raised the theory, they wanted to dismiss any investigation of this as somehow a pro-Trump line. So I think one benefit of Trump losing the election is that now people are more willing to actually just look at the facts. And that's what we need, don't we? We just need scientific, rigorous, open examination of the facts.
Well, look at the people now who are saying the lab theory is credible and needs investigation. Tony Blinken, Biden's Secretary of State, Dr. Fauci, Center for Disease Control in America, who was no fan of President Trump. And then you sort of have to look at the behaviour of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, this lab theory is extremely damaging for Beijing, the Chinese Communist Party. But you would think that if they had any evidence at all that had nothing to do with the lab, they would allow people into the lab in Wuhan. But they've done the exact opposite. They tried to convince all of us it came from bat, but the evidence they presented is extremely shallow at best. Even the World Health Organization head, Dr. Tedros, thinks the investigation wasn't done properly. So circumstantially, you've got to say that we've got to start taking the lab theory far more seriously.
Well, of course, I think the real politic of the situation means that we will never know if it did come from the lab, because China will never open up sufficiently in that lab for the world to get that evidence. But conversely, as you point out, if China had real evidence it came from a wet market, we would know about that soon enough, and that is not forthcoming. I suppose that the key point is, why does this matter? What difference does it make to us? It doesn't lessen the pandemic now, but does it make a difference as to how we fight it or how we prevent it happening again?
Well, of course it does, because whether it comes from an animal, a bat, and then an intermediate animal, or whether it comes from a lab, tells us what we need to do or not do next time to prevent something like this. And bear in mind, this is not one of these black swan events. This is something which scientists had warned about for quite a long time. And if you want to prevent a global disaster like this from happening again, you obviously need to know how it actually started, and therefore what protocols and standards and rules you need. Now, without that data, without that investigation, we're pretty much sort of fighting blind. So I'm afraid, unless there's a dramatic change of heart by the Chinese Communist Party, we will continue to fight blind and just hope that the next pandemic really isn't in our lifetimes.
Yeah, it's a fascinating situation. Let's hope we do get to know more, but it's important that this theory has been treated as a very plausible reality at the moment. Thanks for joining us, John.
Thank you.
Dr. John Lee there with where the world is heading when it comes to the lab leak theory. Something that's just denied by the ABC because of their political games and knocking down Sharri Markson. Sharri Markson has been not just at the lead nationally on this story, she has led the global reporting on this. And as I mentioned, it just about might be the most important story of the decade.